Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about the Webelos Handbook. This is a 1981 printing of a 1967 copyright. And boy did it show. This particular one used to belong to Eric Thomas. Eric's mother's name is Bonnie, and his father's first name begins with a D. You see, not only is this a guidebook to help a boy learn about the world, but it is also the actual registry where they actually put down everything that they've succeeded at to get their little Webelos badges. So there's little, the parents have to sign off on stuff in here, like for example, here's an example. Sign off on stuff in the book to show that the kid actually did what they were supposed to do, and they earned their badges. There's actually, under sportsmen, for example, Eric was apparently very much into baseball. And baseball and soccer. He also enjoyed individual sports of swimming, fishing, and bowling. I've always kind of, is bowling a sport? But, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it is a form of accuracy. So why do I have this book? Because people who know my channel know that I've been very, very critical of the Boy Scouts, with absolute every reason to be very critical of the Boy Scouts, because they're an organization that should be criticized. Well, I used to be a Cub Scout, and then I was a Boy Scout. I was a Webelos, and then eventually I was a Boy Scout proper. And I kind of wanted to walk down memory lane a little bit, and I picked it up at a thrift store for $1. So I was like, okay, I'll look at this, see what it's like, and then I'm gonna get rid of this book because I don't need it. But I also wanted to see what was the Boy Scouts presenting as a manual for children to follow in their paths to adulthood. And you're going to come as no surprise to anybody, but I'm very critical of this book. I'm very critical of this book because the world it represents essentially never existed. This is an example of framing, of a narrative, of a mythology that I was raised with, and millions of other people have been raised with. And it's a great example of white supremacy and white privilege. Because this book, and the worldview it presents, whitewashes our history, whitewashes our culture. It is also a good example of male privilege, of the patriarchy. And yes, I know you're looking at this through the lens of the 21st century, and you're well-read, and you're a feminist. And yes, that is all true. I am well-read. I am a feminist. I am looking at this lens from a 50-year-old in the 21st century. It doesn't change the fact that these things would have been wrong in 1967, just as they're wrong today. It's just that in 1967, that was the narrative that was being told, because the people in charge wanted that narrative told. Now, there are a few illustrations in this book that show black boys. Few. I think there's 3 in the book. Everything else is a white boy. There are no Asian boys in here. There are no brown boys in here of any variety. There are no people wearing turbans in this thing at all. It's just very much a whitewashed world. It's also middle class. Upper middle class in some. There are references in this book that I'm like, this is not a shared experience that most American boys are ever going to have experienced. This is a lot of this seemed to have been aspirational. These are not the experiences of urban kids. And again, it's a way of framing a worldview that would cause boys to be raised with the sense that they did not have a true childhood, because the worldview being shown in this is not a childhood that most kids in America, even in 67, could have or would have had. And that's toxic. Not letting people see themselves in this is horrible. And it's also the book also isn't going to address the realities of gay boys or boys raised in atheist families, and but that particular situation isn't seen in illustrations clearly. Women are also not portrayed all that well. In fact, there's only one illustration in the entire book that shows a woman in a teaching role. She's teaching her Webelo how to cook. Yeah. Okay, so everything else, if they're in there at all, they are very passive. They're background. They're essentially decorations in this. Even though they do half the parenting, or more in some cases, depending on what type of family you're being raised in, where the man goes out and does his thing, and the mother stay at home, takes care of the nest. So a lot of the day-to-day parenting would have been done by the mothers, and she signs off more of the things in this book than Dad did. So I think I've got some evidence that at least in Eric's family, Mom did more of the day-to-day parenting than Dad did. Not surprising. Dad signs off on the sports thing. Feeding right into that narrative now, isn't it? So this was an interesting glimpse both into Eric's life and into the life and the narrative that was being portrayed as the norm back in 1967, when it wasn't. It wasn't the norm. It was simply the lie being sold to a whole lot of Boy Scouts, a whole lot of Webelos. And it would make them grow up thinking that they were inadequate because their lives were not reflected in the book that they carried around and they were trying to aspire to. This is emblematic of the unhealthy structures in the Boy Scouts. And I think I am completely justified in being critical of this book. I mean, this was printed in 1981. I graduated high school in 1982. This isn't that long ago, folks. I know that's going to come as a shock to some of my younger viewers. 81 is not that long ago. Okay, and there are millions of boys that were raised both through the Boy Scouts, the Webelos, the Cub Scouts, what have you, and just in America at large, that were raised to believe in this America that never existed, in this America that was complete and utter fabrication. They believe in America that is the reason we have so many problems today, because they were raised to believe this lie, as opposed to deal with reality. And the reality of all the diversity in America that is completely and utterly ignored in this book. Not to mention half the human species, which is not portrayed well in this book. It goes without saying when they're discussing historical figures, almost all of them are white men. There's a couple in this that aren't. And again, it's all about erasing those that they don't want to talk about and putting forth those that they do. It is just the winners write the history book. Okay? The writers of the books write the history books. And they're even a smaller segment. And they can modify your narrative as much as the people in charge of the country themselves. Heck, look at dictionaries. I got dictionaries all over the place. How they write about language changes the narrative. And reality is that most people that do the writing of dictionaries are white, Christian, straight males. That changes literally the conversation. So it was interesting, and I'll be getting rid of this now. Hopefully someone else can walk down memory lane, and maybe they'll take something of a more pleasant view of it than I did. Because I just found this depressing. Though there were a couple of things that made me smile, because there were a few positive memories I guess I still had. I guess it's good to know they still kicked around inside my head. So this has been my discussion of the Webelos Scout book. The book that, frankly, probably did far more harm than good.